day. Before I proceed with my discussion of the events of the last day, I just wanted to say one thing about the reporting of the events in Moscow, in Red Square on Victory Day yesterday. Now, I've become increasingly accustomed to the fact that there are differences between the way I report events and the way they're reported in some sections of the media in the West. But I have to say, I did find a lot of the reporting in the media in the West of this event on Victory Day strange to the point of being, frankly, surreal. Now, as those of you who followed my video yesterday, watched my video yesterday, will know, I devoted most of the video, most of my coverage of the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow to what I hope was a careful analysis of Vladimir Putin's speech on Red Square. He is, after all, the president of Russia, the president of a country at war, the president of a country in conflict with the West, the leader of the country with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, a country which it has turned out has a critically important role in the world economy, and which, as I've said, is involved in Ukraine, in what is a conflict, obviously, with Ukraine itself, but what is also essentially a proxy war with the West. So it seemed to me that understanding this speech, seeing what Putin himself had to say, that was the most important thing to talk about in relation to the Victory Day celebrations. Well, the Western media thought otherwise. We got a few potted comments about Putin's speech, none of which, it seemed to me, did it anything like justice, or even showed much understanding of many of the points Putin was making, and acres of coverage about the fact that there were fewer items of hardware, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery guns, that kind of thing, on Red Square than has been the case in previous recent parades. And of course, there have even been suggestions, and there's been all kinds of articles that have insinuated this, that this is all proof that the massive depletion of the Russian military as a result of this war, the enormously heavy losses it has allegedly suffered, apparently these are so bad that the Kremlin can't even rustle up a few tanks to put on display on Red Square. Well, I find that absolutely absurd. I have to say, not just absurd, but ridiculous. It comes after the Russians have been hammering Ukraine for several days on end with enormous numbers of missile and bomb strikes, which have hit Ukrainian positions right across the country, causing very serious damage. Even the Ukrainians confirmed that to many of their positions. It also comes, by the way, a few days after Sergei Shoigu, in one of his tours of inspection of the battlefront, was seen photographed with large numbers of T-90M tanks in the background. There's no doubt at all that if the Kremlin had decided that it did want to have tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery on Red Square yesterday, it would have had no difficulty rustling up enough to put on a good show. The fact that the Kremlin, by which I mean, by the way, Putin himself, there was a meeting of the Russian Security Council which he chaired and which actually discussed the Victory Day celebrations just a few days before they took place. Anyway, the fact that the Kremlin decided that it would not put on tanks, infantry fighting vehicles and artillery and would not conduct a flypast on Victory Day, that was clearly a political decision. Nothing more and nothing less. And it is interesting perhaps that that political decision was made, and it does beg a number of questions as to why the Kremlin decided to take this step. And I think, in fact, it's not at all difficult to understand. Putin made a speech in which he essentially said that Russia was at war, in a proxy war with the West, that's defending itself against the forces that the West has thrown against it. It spoke about this being an existential conflict for Russia's future, but not just for Russia's future, but for the future of the world. And obviously, and unsurprisingly, Putin and the rest of the Russian military and political leadership felt that in that kind of context, with Russia involved in what Russia's president says is an existential struggle, it would not be a good call. It would, in fact, be, shall we say, a discordant act to have large numbers of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery pieces trundling through Red Square, when most Russians would probably feel that they were better used or utilized fighting on the battlefield. So that's why it was done that way. There is no other reason, and we should not try and analyze it, and we should not try to draw what are obviously false conclusions from this fact. A lot of the coverage yesterday in the media, in the West, was not just surreal. To my mind, it was frankly dishonest, and it is a case when propaganda, which is something that does happen in war and which one has to acknowledge that it's a part of war, but sometimes propaganda can be bad propaganda, and that was the case in point. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time about this, discussing this incident, because briefly, I don't think it's particularly interesting or important, but I've had a deluge of people contacting me about this, wondering what all of these articles and commentaries in the Western media were about and what they said. Anyway, let me now press on to discuss the events of the last 24 hours. And I'm going to say that this was another day when we didn't get a huge amount of information from the battlefronts. There's lots of information about artillery exchanges in various places, but not really much sign of either side launching any major attacks on the 9th of May. There is one exception, which is Bakhmut, which I will come to in a moment. But let me first of all also say that, of course, the fact that the fighting took on what the Russians call a positional nature, in other words, artillery exchanges and minor tactics and that kind of thing, doesn't mean that there was no fighting at all. And of course, the Russian Air Force and missile forces were still very active. There were heavy airstrikes and missile strikes and drone strikes across Ukraine. And by the way, and importantly, the Russians confirmed yesterday that Iskander-M ballistic missiles were also used in a missile strike on some positions in Kharkiv. And apparently, so the Russians claim that these were successful strikes. And of course, the use of the Iskander-M, the fact that the Russians are able to use it in the way that they do, it seems to me again argues powerfully against the Russians resorting to the use of S-300 surface-to-air missiles, with all the problems that involves, in order to carry out strikes on ground targets. Why would they do that when they have the much more powerful and far more potent Iskander-Ms, which can do that instead? Now, I'm not going to discuss again this topic, which I discussed extensively yesterday, but to reiterate once more, I've had one of these invaluable emails from one of our viewers who's gone over this topic incredibly carefully. There is no evidence that the Russians have used S-300s in a ground attack role at any point over the course of the conflict in Ukraine. And clearly, the claim that they have is one that has been spread by Ukraine for the various reasons that I have discussed in previous programs. Anyway, that was what's been going on elsewhere on the battlefields. What else has been happening? Well, fighting continues in Bakhmut, and we've had another demonstration of the Jekyll and Hyde personality which Yevgeny Prigozhin has become. Now, he has given a whole series of extraordinary statements, made a whole series of extraordinary statements over the last 2 weeks or so. One day, everything is going well, Wagner forces are advancing. The next day, it's furious Prigozhin with tirades against his enemies in the Russian Defense Ministry, comments that are peppered with expletives, incredibly coarse language, accusations of treason being bandied around, and he's being betrayed. The Wagner forces are being betrayed. There are these officers, senior officers in the Russian Defense Ministry, Shoigu and Gerasimov particularly, who are betraying him and who are setting him up and Wagner for disaster. They are apparently prepared for Wagner and Russia to suffer a defeat for no other reason, apparently, than to spite Prigozhin himself and the Wagner organization, which he heads. And as I said yesterday, we got a demonstration once more of the Hyde part of Prigozhin's Jekyll and Hyde personality. Another such tirade, once more, full of expletives. He started by saying that he'd received some kind of instruction from the Russian Defense Ministry, or perhaps warning, that if he did pull his forces out, the Wagner forces out of Bakhmut, without authorization from the Russian High Command, that would be an act of treason, or would be construed as an act of treason. That caused him, as I said, to burst into a furious rage and tantrum. He then alleged that the Wagner forces had been again betrayed, that a brigade of the Russian regular army, the 72nd Brigade, had been counterattacked by Ukrainian forces on the flanks somewhere. Wasn't entirely clear where that was, that the brigade broke in the face of this Ukrainian counterattack, that some of the men in its units fled. The result was that allegedly 3 kilometers of territory, which would be, by the way, an enormous amount of territory, if I've understood Prigozhin's words correctly, but an enormous amount of territory in Bakhmut was supposedly lost. The problem with this story is that it basically does seem to originate entirely from Prigozhin. I say that because I've been trying to follow the various Russian channels, including Redovka, Slavyangrad, all the others, which track events on the battlefields. None of them have mentioned a Ukrainian counterattack on this scale. What they have done after a certain point is that they've reported Prigozhin's words. They said that Prigozhin has alleged this. Now, on the Ukrainian side, there have been claims of a counterattack and also pictures, but these are difficult to assess. And I have a suspicion that these pictures and these claims appeared after Prigozhin's tirade and might in fact have been, to some extent, stimulated or provoked by them. So what did actually happen? Well, there is another problem with Prigozhin's story, which is that a number of people have done checks, tried to find out more about the 72nd Brigade, which Prigozhin says broke in the face of this counterattack, and they have not been able to identify any military unit in the Russian army that is called the 72nd Brigade. Now, it could be that Prigozhin is making a mistake. It might be that he's referencing another unit, entirely different unit, and that he mistakenly thinks that it is the 72nd Brigade. A number of people have pointed out that the Ukrainian army has a unit called the 72nd Brigade, though it doesn't seem to be fighting in the Bakhmut area. But anyway, so there is uncertainty about all of this. And then sometime later, Prigozhin came back, apparently, and has now said that the whole situation has been retrieved, apparently by the Wagner forces themselves. They have recovered most or all of the ground lost to the Ukrainians in this counterattack. So what actually is going on? Can we take any of this seriously? Well, I'm going to say, first of all, that I am beginning to wonder about some of Prigozhin's claims, and I'm beginning to wonder whether some of it, and I have to say this with some regret now, might not be straightforwardly made up. Take, for example, his claim a few days ago that General Surovikin has become, in effect, his line manager. Again, we only have that information from Prigozhin himself. I've seen no statement or indication from the Russian Defense Ministry that this is indeed the case. A purported statement from Surovikin himself circulated about 2 days ago, which appeared to confirm or corroborate not just what Prigozhin was saying about Surovikin's appointment, but other things that Prigozhin was saying. Except, to be frank, I am very dubious about the provenance of that statement and its contents, and I noticed that, again, the more reliable channels have not referenced it, which I assume they would have done if they were confident that it appeared that it had been made by Surovikin himself. So maybe Surovikin has indeed been appointed Prigozhin's line manager, but as I said, I'm beginning to wonder whether that is in fact actually so. And I have to say that this incident of the Ukrainian counterattack and the supposed collapse of the 72nd Brigade, well, it might not be total fiction, but I suspect that Prigozhin has, at the very least, exaggerated it and added circumstantial details like the 72nd Brigade breaking under pressure, which basically comes from his own imagination. Now, it is entirely likely that the Ukrainians have launched their own counterattacks, probably along these asphalt roads. They're trying to cling on to these roads, to continue to use them. Whenever the Russians capture a stretch of these roads, which they do from time to time, the Ukrainians, unsurprisingly, try to push them back. This has been going on all the time now for several weeks, and it's not impossible that a local counterattack of that nature did indeed take place. And it is also not at all impossible that in the face of such a counterattack, the Russians temporarily gave ground. They've done that several times previously. But I have to say that in the absence of a lot more corroboration, independent corroboration of what Prigozhin himself said about this incident, I am not going to take it terribly seriously. I suspect that there was a counterattack. Prigozhin says that the positions were retaken. I think that more than likely that was all that happened, and that Prigozhin is exaggerating it. Of course, I could be wrong, but I'd like to see a lot more evidence of that first. What I think is quite likely is that the Russian Defense Ministry probably did tell Prigozhin that it really isn't up to him whether or not the Wagner forces pull out of Bakhmut or not. And I think that is obvious. I mean, I cannot imagine any other army tolerating a situation in a war where an officer, and bear in mind, Prigozhin isn't even technically speaking an officer. He's not even an officer of the Wagner organization. He is a civilian. Anyway, where an officer takes it upon himself to vacate the field of battle with his men because he is unhappy about the amount of shells he's getting. So I can very well imagine that someone in the Russian High Command gave this warning to Prigozhin, and I suspect that that probably did upset him. And I also suspect that what also upset him is the fact that, contrary to his hopes, Wagner wasn't able to capture the last remaining buildings under Ukrainian control in Bakhmut on the 9th of May. Clearly there is fighting going on. Even the Institute for the Study of War admits that the Wagner forces are continuing to advance. They seem to be in the process of attacking the two main remaining buildings under Ukrainian control in the western fringes of Bakhmut. But they haven't captured them yet, and I can imagine that Prigozhin was angered by this, and since he clearly did want a victory by the 9th of May, despite his own denials, at least that's my own view, and he was furious about this and about the reprimand he got from the Russian Defense Ministry. Now, I'm also going to say something further. I suspect that there is some kind of a power struggle underway within the Wagner organization, or shall we say, over control of the Wagner organization. I have been provided with information about this, which I'm not going to discuss or disclose on this program. I don't think I can. It's been provided by private sources, and I don't want to go into too much detail. But I get the sense that more and more people within the Russian political and military hierarchy, including, importantly, within the Wagner organization itself, and people who were involved in setting it up and who have operational control over it, have become utterly exasperated by Prigozhin's behavior, and that he is gradually becoming sidelined. For example, the announcement a few days ago that the Wagner forces will not apparently withdraw from Bakhmut by the 10th of May, on the 10th of May, which incidentally is today. Prigozhin made a statement suggesting that that was his decision. I wonder whether it really was. I wonder whether somebody hasn't acted to countermand whatever orders Prigozhin thinks he has made. Anyway, this whole affair is very confusing and very destabilizing. As I said, Russian soldiers across the battlefronts must be bewildered by what is going on and must be concerned and must be wondering whether these allegations that Prigozhin is making repeatedly are true. And I can't help but think that once the situation in Bakhmut is resolved and the Wagner forces are indeed taken out of the battle, whether in fact we will start to see less of Prigozhin than we have up to this point. I'm going to just add one further point here, which is that, again, one particular source that's been providing me exceptionally important information about the Wagner group has suggested to me that when it is indeed taken out of the battle and subjected to a major reorganization in the rear, its structure will change, and that from being essentially a light infantry force backed by a very significant amount of artillery, that it will start from that moment forward to become more heavily mechanized and capable, therefore, of more mechanized combat. In other words, that it will be made a rather more powerful and professional force than it has been. And I'm going to also suggest that at that point, it will probably also be brought more formally within the Russian structures, official structures. This source also confirmed that Wagner has indeed parted with a large number of both former convicts whose 6-month contracts have indeed expired, and also some professional troops whose contracts have expired, and that this has been happening as a sort of cumulative process since January. He did say that around 15% of these former conscripts apparently apply to Wagner when their contracts expire to be taken on a full-time basis, which is interesting. Not all of them are accepted, apparently. And it also seems that as part of this larger reorganization, there's going to be a decision has been made to significantly reduce the extent to which the Wagner organization does from now on recruit in prisons. And given that that seems to have been one of the reasons, recruitment from prisons, why Prigozhin, who obviously has served a prison sentence, one of the reasons why he was brought in the first place, one can see that if the decision has been made to move away from that, that his usefulness, quite apart from the other problems that he's creating, that his usefulness might be seen by some people to be waning. Anyway, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens today. As I said, 10th of May was supposed to be the day when, according to Prigozhin, a couple of days ago, the Wagner forces were supposed to withdraw from Bakhmut. We'll see whether anything like that does actually happen today. No indication of that for the moment. And we'll see what happens in this battle overall. And as I said, I can't help but think that Prigozhin's conduct probably means that his days as a prominent figure in this war are now numbered, and that the leadership, not just of the Russian military, but of the Wagner organization itself, will want to dispense with his services before long. Well, that's all I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefronts. There isn't very much more at the moment. We're all still waiting for this Ukrainian offensive. And there's been a number of statements about this. Danilov, who is the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, the body which, for the record, I believe is by far the single most powerful body in Ukraine, more powerful than the Ukrainian General Staff, and more powerful than the political team around Zelensky himself. I'm not going to discuss why I think that, but anyway, that's what I believe. Anyway, Danilov has come out and said that there isn't going to be an offensive immediately because the plan for it has not yet been finalized. That may be true. It may be disinformation intended to deceive the Russians. It may be all kinds of things. Who's to say? But anyway, that is what Danilov has said. Cleverly, the British Foreign Secretary has now also come out and said that one should not expect decisive outcomes from this offensive, which, as I said, again begs the question of what the purpose of this offensive in that case is. If it's not going to achieve very much, if hundreds and thousands of men are going to die to capture a couple of scores of kilometers of territory, then frankly, it is beginning to resemble some of those stories about the fighting on the Western Front in the First World War, in which the British especially launched attacks, offensives against the Germans, which captured a few isolated plots of ground, but which didn't in the end change anything significant in the war. Or at least that's the myth, or at least that's the story about that war. I know that there are some people who dispute that. But anyway, if it is a myth, if it's not true, then some people seem to be intent on making it true in Ukraine. Because as I said, I can't understand personally why one would want to send men to their deaths to capture a small amount of territory if the effect of doing that is not going to be decisive. And then we had a further statement from the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. He says that Ukraine has been given all the equipment it needs, and that it's not just equipment that's important. In fact, even more important is the training the Ukrainians have obtained that apparently is going to make up, together with their high morale for their lack of numbers, their lack of machines, all of those things. Now, others have been talking about this offensive as well, and there's been a particularly interesting article by Larry Johnson, former CIA official, officer, and analyst, as well as a person who's actually worked in active operations, if you will. Anyway, Larry Johnson has commented upon a sudden shift in the mood from Polish officers. And I've already previously, in earlier videos, discussed the doubts that the Chief of Staff of the Polish military, General Andrzejczak, as I said, apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. But anyway, the doubts about the offensive that General Andrzejczak is now having. But, as Larry Johnson says, it seems that even more pessimistic comments are now being made by General Valdemar Skripczak, who, again, I apologize to Polish people if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. But anyway, General Skripczak up to now has been one of those people who has been most optimistic about Ukraine's conduct of the war. And Larry Johnson makes the point that Skripczak has now given an interview in which he says that I think the truth is that the Russians are winning. He then talks about the lack of supplies and training that the Ukrainians have received. And he says that there simply aren't enough forces to carry out an offensive properly. He said if the Americans say now that they were building 9 armoured brigades, these 9 armoured brigades are only there to conduct small, shallow operational activities. If one talks about a counteroffensive, that is a term that is practically strategic in nature. For such an attack, for such a counteroffensive, one would need not 9, but rather 19 to 20 armoured brigades. And he then goes on to say the point of the spearhead apparently being prepared by Ukraine for the spring counteroffensive is to penetrate deeply into Russian lines, and that requires that the main attacking force needs its flanks to be protected. And in order to achieve a really big breakthrough, this potential has to be 3 times larger than the one declared by the Americans. And then he goes on to say that Ukraine does not have the potential to take back 20% of its territories. If Ukraine were to retake them, Ukraine would need a 3-to-1 advantage over the Russian army along the entire front on the strategic level. Ukraine would need around 2 million soldiers to rout them. That's, I suspect, roughly right. We're told that the Russians have roughly 500,000 men in the theatre. You multiply that by 3, you get a force of 1.5 million. But of course, you'd probably need a supplemental force as well in reserve to counter whatever forces you would need to support them. And so one can understand why Scripjack is saying that Ukraine would need 2 million men to win the war. And then he says they have no chance of this because they do not have the equipment. The plants, the factories of the West have no such possibilities, no such potential. Hence the efforts on the part of the diplomats to end this conflict, as it could turn out in a few months that we will not have anything to help Ukraine with. And in the meantime, Josep Borrell, the European Union's foreign minister, I put that in quotation marks, he's also been coming out with statements of his own. He says that if the West loses the ability, cannot sustain Ukraine, if it can't provide weapons and material and ammunition, money to Ukraine, then Ukraine's ability to continue the war ends within a few days. And that's Borrell's comment. And that he says that obviously if the West were to decide to cut off aid to Ukraine, the war would end immediately, which is an interesting admission, by the way, by Borrell. It's effectively Borrell admitting that it is the West that is prolonging the war. And Borrell says that it would not be in the West's interests for that to happen. In other words, the West's interests are served by prolonging the war. Again, I'm not sure that Borrell quite understands quite the gravity of what he is admitting to. But obviously that then leads to the further question, which is the one touched on by General Skripchak, whether the West does in fact have the means to keep this war going on in the way that it is indefinitely. Now, Jeff Roberts, the historian, has an invaluable practice of emailing to various of his contacts, various articles that have appeared in various places discussing aspects of this war. He's, by the way, circulating an article he himself has written, which I should say is an exceptional article, in which he discusses and lays to rest this whole myth that there is some analogy between the 1930s, the appeasement of the 1930s, and the supposed appeasement of Putin and of Russia, which some people are insisting should not happen today. You want to read this article, it's on a site called Pearls and Irritations, John Menadew's Public Policy Journal. I might return to this very important article at some point later. But anyway, suffice to say that he's also highlighted an article in the National Interest, which is about the Patriot missile system that the United States has recently supplied to Ukraine. Now, the National Interest is one of these big journals that the United States has that discusses foreign and military policy. It purports to be marginally more realistic than some of the others, but neocons do occasionally write for it. It was in National Interest, for example, that Wes Mitchell, former State Department official, wrote an extraordinary article back in August 2021, in which he spoke about before the war, in other words, in which he spoke about the importance of splitting Russia away from China, and in what I am convinced was the original draft of this article, seems to have been substantially re-edited since it was first written, or since I first read it. As I recall, in that first draft from August 2021, he suggested that the way to split the Russians from the Chinese was to engineer a defeat for Russia in Ukraine, which would then presumably lead to a political crisis in Moscow and a reorientation of Russian policy onto Russia's side, with the analogy being the way in which Germany was able to, or rather Prussia, Bismarck, was able to basically gain control of Habsburg foreign policy after he defeated Austria in the War of 1866. So we see that neocons do also write for National Interest, even though, as I said, it does sometimes tilt slightly, ever so slightly, towards the more realist view of things. But this article is not about foreign policy as such. It is a more realistic article, though, because it is about the Patriot missile system that has been supplied by the United States to Ukraine, and which some people are talking up as a wonder weapon, and which some people in Ukraine have falsely alleged, and I want to reiterate again that it is an entirely false claim, repudiated by the Ukrainian Air Defense Command themselves, have falsely claimed shot down a Kinjal hypersonic missile system. As I said, the extent of the denials has been very, very fully discussed by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas in a video which you can find there. But anyway, this article by Jeff Lemire discusses the Patriot system that the United States has supplied to Ukraine. And again, I find this article an interesting article because it does two things. Firstly, it again confirms the problems with the Patriot system highlighted by several people who are familiar with the system, or at least have some conceptual knowledge of it. And I've received private emails about this from all kinds of people who've made exactly the same points that are going to appear in this article. Brian Beletic has made these points as well. Every single point that I'm going to read, Brian Beletic has made in his videos. So, to my knowledge, has Scott Ritter in the various many places that he now provides his information as well. But the point about this is that this article appears in National Interest. And this is what this article says. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to just read what I consider to be the relevant paragraphs. Ukraine faces threats that run the span of Russia's missile and drone arsenal. Russia's unmanned aerial systems range from consumer-grade reconnaissance drones to more sophisticated Iranian-made kamikaze drones. They also include much more sophisticated drones than that, including, by the way, Orlan 10 surveillance drones, which are highly sophisticated, even if small, and now the Russians are starting to use increasingly their Orion drones, which are the kind of drones that basically resemble the Reaper and the Predator that the United States uses. So it isn't, the Russians aren't just reliant on Uranium-2 drones and crude drones, and of course there's the Lancet drone, which the Russians have used very effectively to destroy Ukrainian artillery and tanks and S-300 missile systems. I've discussed it before. It's proved a much more successful system, by the way, than the American analog, the Switchblade drone, which apparently the Pentagon is so unhappy with that it's now cancelled orders and terminated production. But anyway, to continue with this article, several classes of drones are interceptable by Patriot, but then it becomes both a tactical and economic issue. Drones can use their maneuverability and terrain-hugging flight patterns to remain undetected by Patriot radars. And in fact, that has happened already. The Houthis in the Yemen war have demonstrated that. They've launched drone attacks with fairly crude drones against Saudi targets, which have been able to invade Patriot radar systems. But anyway, to continue with the article, moreover, it's questionable to use $3 million interceptors to take out drones that cost orders of magnitude less. Orders of magnitude, some of these drones which have bypassed Patriot radars in the Yemen war are said to cost as little as a couple of $1,000 each. But anyway, to continue, this is particularly the case when Ukraine's supply of Soviet-era interceptors is slated to run out soon, and US resupply of Stinger missiles remains similarly strained. This would leave Patriot as the sole defense Ukraine has against Russian air supremacy. Well, there are other systems. There's the Iris-T, supplied by Germany. Not clear how effective that's been. There's the ASPEED system, which the French and Italians are going to supply in July, but this is available in very limited numbers. There's the Hawk system, also supplied by the Western powers. Apparently one battery supplied to Ukraine turned out to be a dud, and this is anyway an old system. But anyway, to continue, the United States can't just throw more interceptors at Ukraine either. For one, they're a precious commodity. Washington only bought 252 PAC-3 MSC interceptors this year for the entire US Army, and many of these will be used to phase out more antiquated interceptors. Brian Beletic has made precisely that point, and he's also highlighted the great difficulties the United States has in increasing production of Patriot missiles. The latest US arms package to Ukraine, announced just yesterday, apparently does include more air defense systems, but I'm not sure that it identifies Patriot missiles as amongst those systems that are going to be supplied, and if it does, I suspect that it probably won't tell us how many, and the chances are it will not be many. And then the article goes on to say, Patriot operating on its lonesome is a tenuous proposition at best. Whilst a first-rate system technologically, the Patriot cannot be used to full effect if it is divorced from air defence doctrine. Patriot systems are limited to pinpoint defence of major assets and are designed to operate in tandem with air defences engaging targets at higher and lower altitudes. Without these additions, Patriot will have too many threats to engage, and the result will either be porous coverage that doesn't protect its defended assets, or coverage that quickly subsides when Patriot runs out of interceptors. Moreover, Patriot systems are themselves vulnerable. Operating a Patriot radar system gives away its location, making it an open target for Russian attacks. This means that Patriot is not a one-stop shop for defending Ukraine's military assets or its people. Now, as I said, these points have already been made. They've been made many times by many people. Brian Beletic discussed, as I remember in one of his videos, how any air defense system only operates effectively as part of a layered defense system. And, well, we've seen that in Ukraine, we've seen that in many wars. And as to the vulnerability of air defense missiles systems to potential attack, well, the Russians are demonstrating that every day in Ukraine. Hardly a day passes now without the Russians attacking and claiming that they've destroyed some Ukrainian air defense system somewhere. And we had that spectacular destruction of the S-300 missiles in Kherson region by Lancet drones about 2 weeks ago. So all of this has, as I said, appeared elsewhere and before, but it's now appearing in the national interest. The United States cannot keep Ukraine supplied with tanks, ammunition, 155mm ammunition, we've heard all about that, and air defense missiles to the extent that Ukraine needs to sustain the war. The United States has again said that it will not supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. And the explanation for that, the real reason for that, I think has been quietly acknowledged by the US, not the range of this system. It is that there simply aren't enough of them for the United States to be able to fulfill Ukraine's needs. The United States is now apparently telling Ukraine, well, we're not going to supply you with ATACMS missiles, but the British are going to supply you with the air-launched Storm Shadow missile, which will make up for your lack of ATACMS missiles and which has a similar range. Well, anybody who thinks that the British are able to manufacture vast numbers of Storm Shadow missiles, that they have a superior manufacturing capability for missiles than the United States does, I'm afraid is living in the land of illusions. I don't believe there are any people who believe that. Britain cannot provide Ukraine with a capability that the United States is not able to fill. And of course, the Storm Shadow might be an effective system. I have no way of knowing one way or another, but it is air-launched, not ground-launched. The Russians have shown repeatedly that they can shoot down Ukrainian aircraft. Again, they do so on a regular basis. It's quite a long time now since Ukraine was able successfully to shoot down a Russian aircraft. And General Cavalli, the US commander of NATO forces in Europe, has said that the Russians have lost around 80 aircraft over the course of the conflict, but they still have 1,000 more. Their aircraft losses, in other words, have been relatively light, unlike Ukraine's losses. This is just a fantasy that Britain is going to be able to make up for shortages of long-range missiles. And besides, every indication is that the Russians can shoot down missiles like the ATACMS, the Storm, Shadow, all of these missiles as well. So there is no conceivable way that the Western powers can make up, in supply terms, the military deficiencies that Ukraine is experiencing. So coming back to Josep Borrell, when he says that the war will end in a couple of days if the West desists from providing military support, perhaps he's being prescient. Perhaps at some point even he understands that Western support cannot continue indefinitely, and that we will reach that point when there has to be a peace in Ukraine, even if it is not the kind of peace that the West wants. Now, of course, I will say this also. There are some Ukrainian officials, including the Air Defense Command, who say that what Ukraine really needs are fighter jets, and who are pushing intensively for supplies of F-16s. I've heard many commentaries now about the immense problems of training Ukrainian pilots to operate F-16s, that this would take years to be achieved effectively. But again, I've also seen a recent report from US Air Force officers, former Air Force officers, who make the point about the F-16, that it's a fourth generation fighter jet. In other words, it's a fighter jet of the same generation as the MiG-29. By the way, and for the record, the F-16 entered service with the US Air Force before the MiG-29 entered service with the Soviet Air Force. Obviously, the contemporary versions of the F-16 are more advanced than the versions of the F-16 that entered service with the US Air Force in the 1970s. But then the same probably is true of later iterations of the MiG-29, which is still operated by the Russian Air Force. Anyway, I'm not going to get drawn into that discussion. But anyway, those ex-US Air Force people said that the F-16, like the Patriot, is not a miracle weapon. The Russians can shoot it down. The Air Force, the aircraft the Russians are operating in Ukraine, the Sukhoi 35s and 57s and MiG-31s, are much more powerful than the F-16, and of course the Russian air defense system is much more effective at shooting down planes of this kind, is very effective at shooting down planes of this kind as well. So, if Borrell acknowledges that the war can be over in days, and that it only needs a decision from the West, and given all of these problems, and given all these doubts about this offensive, I again answer the question, why go forward with this offensive? Why not start those negotiations right away? Obviously, there are some people in Ukraine who vehemently oppose these negotiations. But can they really prevail if the West tells Ukraine that there's nothing more that can be done? I can't help but think that this offensive is being staged by some people in the West, that they're encouraging this offensive, essentially as a way of getting themselves off the hook. They can say, we've given everything we have to Ukraine. It's for the Ukrainians to make the best use of it now. If the offensive fails, then they can turn around and say to the Ukrainians, well, we did all we could. We've tried as hard as we can. We've given you all the weapons and all the money that we can realistically give you. And you can't reasonably expect us to do more. And therefore, we have to scale back our support and start worrying about other things. Be a cynical approach to take, but I can understand why there might be some people, some of the more realist people in the National Security Council and the Defense Department who are starting to think that way. And perhaps they've been given today another reason why, from their point of view, it would be wise to try to end this war quickly. Because today the Russians announced that they are formally pulling out of the Conventional Forces Treaty. Now, way back in 2002, they suspended their participation in it. The Conventional Forces Treaty was a treaty agreed at the tail end of the Cold War, whereby the forces on each side, the conventional forces on each side, would be scaled down and would not be positioned in various locations where they might be threatening to each other. At the time when the Russians suspended their participation in this treaty, which, as I said, was in 2002, they were basically saying that the treaty had become inoperable because of the steps that the United States and its allies had already taken, which in effect undermined it. The eastward expansion of NATO, the withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the decision by the United States to forward base anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Romania and Poland, the fact that those bases for those anti-ballistic missile interceptors could be converted easily and quickly to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles at Russia from forward positions, in effect violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which at that time was still in effect. And obviously, the events of the last few years have taken, from a Russian point of view, any logic in pretending that the Conventional Forces Treaty can be revived entirely off the table. We're now involved in a proxy conflict in Ukraine. The Russians, just before Christmas, announced a massive build-up of their conventional forces, which will obviously be forward positioned in Europe. There is a conventional arms race underway with the Russians, with their military industries cranking up, are ahead in. So this is not a good call, or so I would have thought, for NATO and for the United States, especially the United States, which is now also engaged in a naval arms race in the Pacific with China. And let me repeat again a point I've made many times. China's manufacturing capacity is greater than that of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. And with Russia at its back, it also has it can draw further on raw materials and food, and by the way, certain important technologies, effectively without limit. So the United States is now really looking at a two-front war. Going back to that article by Wes Mitchell in the National Interest in August 2021 that I discussed earlier in this program, he spoke about the importance of splitting Russia off from China because of the danger of the United States facing great power military competition on two fronts simultaneously, potentially being dragged into a two-front war. But all that plotting and intriguing and conspiring, if that's what it was, over Ukraine to prevent that from happening. It's in fact done the opposite. It's accelerated it. The Russians are now going to build up in Europe at the same time that the Chinese are building up in the Pacific, and in fact the actions that the administration has taken are accelerating this process. Now, it is completely unsurprising that the more sober-minded and realistic people in the US government, people like, one suspects, General Milley and General Cavalli, are saying, we have got to get off this train. We've got to find some way of stabilizing the situation in Europe, at least, before it gets completely out of control. And I am starting to think that they're beginning to win the argument. Maybe these comments by Borrell reflect this. This talk about the fact that, we can end the war in days, but the outcome would not be in our favor. To me, that looks like a reflection of some kind of internal discussion. And we also saw those reports a few days ago that the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan in other words, had basically split from the ideological hardliners in the State Department, Blinken and Nuland, and that they're also all now looking for a way out. Well, we will see what happens. But for the moment, the war goes on, things are stuck, and I want to reiterate again, it's far from certain to me that the Russians are looking to compromise, and Putin's speech yesterday, I have to say this, suggested to me that they are not. Well, that's me for today. Thank you for joining me again today. We will no doubt get more clarity about what's going on in Bakhmut over the next 24 hours. As I said, we'll see whether Prigozhin Hyde is replaced by Prigozhin Jiku. We'll see what the Wagner organization does in Bakhmut, whether it stays or goes, or advances or retreats. As I said, there must be great anger in Moscow at the confusion that Prigozhin is generating. Anyway, we will see what happens. But for the moment, that's me for today. It only remains for me to wish you all a very good day, to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and that you can also check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. Lastly, please remember, if you've liked this video, to hit the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And it only remains for me now to say a very good day and to hope that you will all again join me soon.